The cold morning air of March 1st, 2014, carried the sounds of Washington District of Columbia stirring to life. The faint rumble of metro trains echoed through the underground tunnels, while the city's homeless population shuffled through the corridors of the District of Columbia General Shelter, a sprawling complex that housed hundreds of families in temporary refuge. Among them was 8-year-old Relisha Rudd, a bright-eyed girl with dark hair and a purple Helly Hansen winter jacket that had become her signature piece of clothing. She wore pink boots that morning, small feet padding across the worn linoleum floors of the shelter that had become her temporary home. The shelter itself was a monument to the city's struggle with homelessness, a concrete structure that buzzed with the constant activity of families in transition. The air inside was thick with the smell of industrial cleaning supplies and the lingering aroma of communal meals prepared in bulk. Children's voices echoed through hallways where fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows, creating an environment that was both protective and institutional. For Relisha, this place represented stability in a life that had known little of it. If you're watching this story unfold, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us continue bringing these important stories to light. Relisha lived at the shelter with her mother, Shamika Young, a woman trying to navigate the complex web of social services and temporary housing that defines life on the margins of the nation's capital. The District of Columbia General Shelter was operated by the Community Partnership for the Prevention of Homelessness, a contractor that managed several of the city's homeless programs. Within this system, dozens of employees worked to maintain order and provide basic services to the vulnerable population that called the shelter home, even temporarily. Among these employees was 51-year-old Kahlil Tatum, a janitor whose presence at the shelter would later become the central mystery in one of Washington's most haunting disappearances. Tatum moved through the shelter corridors with the familiarity of someone who had worked there long enough to know every family, every child, every corner where problems might hide. His job required him to maintain the cleanliness of the facility, but his interactions with residents went far beyond his official duties. The surveillance cameras that lined the hallways of the Days Inn on New York Avenue captured what would become the last confirmed sighting of Relisha Rudd. The grainy black-and-white footage shows a small figure walking beside a much larger man, her distinctive purple jacket unmistakable even in the poor-quality recording. The timestamp read March 1st, 2014, and the image would soon become seared into the memory of everyone who saw it. She walked with the trust of a child who believed she was safe, unaware that this moment would mark her disappearance into a mystery that would grip the city and never let go. The hotel corridor where they walked was like thousands of others across America, carpeted in patterns designed to hide stains, with walls painted in neutral colors that suggested temporary comfort rather than a permanent home. The sounds of television sets leaked from behind closed doors, mixing with the hum of ice machines and the distant traffic from New York Avenue. It was an ordinary place that would become extraordinary for all the wrong reasons, a setting where the final act of a young girl's known life would play out in silence. What makes Relisha's case particularly haunting is not just her disappearance, but the length of time that passed before anyone realized she was gone. The bureaucratic machinery that was supposed to protect vulnerable children had somehow allowed an 8-year-old to slip through its mechanisms unnoticed. The school system, the shelter administration, and the social services network all played roles in a tragedy that unfolded in slow motion, each day of silence adding weight to what was already becoming an unbearable situation. The relationship between Tatum and Relisha's family had developed over time, built on small gestures that gradually created trust and dependency. Tatum had presented himself as a helpful figure, someone who could provide things that a homeless mother might struggle to give her child. He bought Relisha gifts, including a tablet that became precious to her in an environment where personal possessions were limited. He took her to see Disney on Ice, an experience that must have felt magical to a girl whose world had been constrained by the walls of the shelter and the uncertainty of temporary housing. These outings represented more than entertainment. They were windows into a different world, one where a child could feel special and cared for in ways that the institutional environment of the shelter could not provide. The ice skating show would have filled the arena with music and colorful costumes, the performers gliding across the ice with a grace that must have seemed otherworldly to Relisha. The crowd's excitement, the smell of popcorn and the bright lights would have created memories that she carried back to her small space in the shelter. But beneath these seemingly generous gestures lay a pattern that child safety experts recognize as grooming, the gradual process by which predators build relationships with their victims and their families. Tatum's criminal history, which included convictions for burglary, larceny, and breaking and entering, should have raised red flags in a system designed to protect vulnerable populations. He had served time in prison from 1993 to 2003, and again from 2004 to 2011, yet he had been hired to work in close contact with homeless families and their children. The hiring practices at the shelter would later come under intense scrutiny, but in the early months of 2014, Tatum moved freely through the facility, developing relationships with residents that went far beyond his job description. Staff members would later report that he was known for inappropriate fraternization with shelter residents and for paying particular attention to young girls. These warning signs existed in plain sight, observed by colleagues who either didn't understand their significance or didn't know how to report their concerns effectively. As February turned to March, Relisha stopped attending Payne Elementary School, an absence that should have triggered immediate intervention, but instead became lost in the complexity of a system serving vulnerable children. Her grandmother, Melissa Young, provided the school with a note explaining that the child was experiencing health problems and was under the care of a Dr. Tatum. The use of the medical title gave the explanation an air of legitimacy that school officials accepted without further investigation. The note represented a crucial moment in the timeline of Relisha's disappearance, a piece of documentation that allowed her absence to continue without raising alarms. School personnel, dealing with the complex needs of homeless students who often missed classes due to family instability, accepted the medical explanation as reasonable. The communication came through official channels and seemed to follow proper procedures, but it was built on a fundamental deception that would not be discovered until it was far too late. When school officials attempted to contact Dr. Tatum to discuss Relisha's continued absence and arrange for her educational needs, they scheduled a meeting that never took place. Tatum failed to appear at the appointed time, leaving school counselors with unanswered questions and growing concerns about a student who had simply vanished from their daily routines. The empty chair in the meeting room represented more than a missed appointment. It was the first clear sign that something was seriously wrong. The counselor who made the decision to contact police would later be recognized as the person whose action finally set the wheels of investigation in motion. But by that time, Relisha had been missing from school for 30 days. 30 days during which an 8-year-old girl's absence went unnoticed by the systems designed to track and protect her. 30 days during which her trail grew colder and her chances of being found alive diminished with each passing hour. The Metropolitan Police Department of the District of Columbia launched their missing persons investigation on March 19, 2014, 18 days after Relisha was last seen on the hotel surveillance footage. The delay in reporting would become one of the most criticized aspects of the case, raising questions about how a child could disappear for so long without triggering the protective mechanisms that society had put in place. Detective work that might have been straightforward in the first hours after a disappearance became exponentially more complex as the trail grew cold. The investigation immediately focused on the surveillance footage that had captured Relisha's last known movements. The images from the Holiday Inn Express on February 26th showed her walking with Tatum through the hotel corridors, her purple jacket and pink boots making her easily identifiable despite the grainy quality of the recording. The footage from March 1st at the Days Inn showed them entering a hotel room together, a moment that would become the last verified proof that Relisha was still alive. These hotel corridors became crime scenes in retrospect, ordinary spaces transformed by the knowledge of what they might have witnessed. The Holiday Inn Express on Bladensburg Road Northeast and the Days Inn on New York Avenue were typical budget hotels, the kind that serve travelers looking for basic accommodations in the nation's capital. Their security cameras, installed for routine monitoring and theft prevention, had inadvertently captured what might be the final moments of a child's life. The investigation team faced the challenge of reconstructing events from fragmentary evidence, trying to understand what had happened during the weeks when Relisha should have been in school, but was instead moving through a series of hotel rooms with a man who had no legal right to have custody of her. The gaps in the timeline were filled with questions that might never be answered. What did they do during those days? Where did they go? What did Relisha think was happening to her? As detectives worked to piece together Relisha's final days, another tragedy was unfolding that would forever change the trajectory of the investigation. On March 20, 2014, the same day that police officially launched their search for Relisha, the body of 51-year-old Andrea Tatum was discovered in a Red Roof Inn hotel room in Prince George's County, Maryland. She had been shot in the head with what appeared to be execution-style precision, a single gunshot behind her left ear that suggested both intimacy and brutality. The discovery of Andrea Tatum's body transformed the missing child case into a murder investigation, adding layers of complexity and urgency to an already desperate search. Surveillance footage from the Maryland hotel showed both Andrea and Kahlil Tatum entering the hotel room the night before her body was found, establishing a clear timeline that pointed to her husband as the primary suspect in her murder. The fact that this killing occurred on the same day that Relisha was officially reported missing could not be dismissed as coincidence. The hotel room in Prince George's County became a crime scene that investigators hoped would provide clues about Relisha's fate. The sterile environment of the budget hotel, with its mass-produced furniture and generic decorations, had witnessed an act of violence that suggested desperation and a willingness to eliminate anyone who might pose a threat to Kahlil Tatum's freedom. The lack of signs of struggle indicated that Andrea Tatum had been caught completely off guard, possibly by someone she trusted completely. Detectives theorized that Andrea Tatum might have discovered something about her husband's relationship with Relisha, information that made her a threat to whatever plan he was executing. The timing of her murder, occurring just one day after Relisha's last confirmed sighting, suggested that events were moving rapidly toward a conclusion that Tatum was determined to control. The cold calculation required to kill his own wife pointed to a level of desperation and criminal intent that made Relisha's situation seem even more dire. The search for Kahlil Tatum became a manhunt that mobilized law enforcement resources across the region, but the man they were looking for had essentially vanished. His last confirmed sighting was on March 2nd, the day after the final footage of Relisha, when he was captured on surveillance cameras purchasing items that would later take on sinister significance: a shovel, lime, and 42-gallon trash bags. These purchases, made at different locations throughout the day, suggested preparation for activities that investigators preferred not to contemplate. The items Tatum purchased painted a picture of premeditation that chilled everyone involved in the investigation. A shovel suggested burial, lime implied an attempt to accelerate decomposition, and industrial-sized trash bags indicated the need to contain and transport something large. These were not the random purchases of someone acting impulsively. They were the calculated acquisitions of someone who had thought carefully about what he needed to do and how he planned to do it. For 10 days, law enforcement agencies across the region searched for any sign of Kahlil Tatum, following leads that took them through the urban neighborhoods of Washington and into the rural areas of Maryland and Virginia. The search involved multiple jurisdictions, from the Metropolitan Police Department to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, all working together to find a man who seemed to have disappeared as completely as the child he was suspected of taking. The manhunt came to an end on March 31, 2014, when searchers found Kahlil Tatum's body in a maintenance shed in the Kenilworth Park and Aquatic Gardens in northeast Washington. He had died from a single gunshot wound to the head, fired from the same weapon that had killed his wife. The gun lay beside his body in what appeared to be a carefully staged suicide, the final act of someone who had decided that capture was not an option he was willing to consider. Kenilworth Park and Aquatic Gardens is a place of unexpected beauty within the urban landscape of Washington, a 700-acre preserve where wetlands and walking trails provide refuge for both wildlife and city dwellers seeking contact with nature. The park's aquatic gardens bloom with water lilies during the summer months, creating spaces of tranquility that seem worlds away from the city's problems. But on that March morning, the park became the final scene in a tragedy that had claimed at least 2 lives, and possibly 3. The maintenance shed where Tatum's body was found was a utilitarian structure, the kind of building that park's personnel used to store equipment and supplies away from public view. It was isolated enough to provide privacy for someone seeking to end his life, but accessible enough that the body would eventually be found. The choice of location seemed to reflect Tatum's state of mind in his final moments, seeking both solitude and eventual discovery. With Tatum's death, the last person who could provide answers about Relisha's fate was gone, taking his secrets with him to whatever judgment awaited beyond life. The investigation continued, but it now had to proceed without the possibility of questioning the primary suspect, without the chance of obtaining a confession, and without hope of learning where Relisha might be found. The silence left by Tatum's suicide was more devastating than any words he might have spoken. The extensive search for Relisha's remains began immediately after Tatum's body was discovered, focusing on areas where the items he had purchased might have been put to use. Search teams combed through Kenilworth Park with ground-penetrating radar, search dogs, and dozens of volunteers who had been moved by the story of the missing girl. The aquatic gardens and surrounding wetlands were systematically examined, but the search revealed nothing that could bring closure to the investigation. The search expanded beyond the park to include other locations where Tatum might have taken Relisha during the weeks she was missing. Abandoned buildings in northeast Washington, vacant lots in Maryland, rural areas in Virginia where a shovel and lime might have been used for their intended purpose, all became potential crime scenes. Each location searched without results added to the growing sense that Relisha might never be found, that her final resting place might remain one of Washington's most closely guarded secrets. The community response to Relisha's disappearance revealed both the best and worst aspects of American society's treatment of vulnerable populations. When news of the missing girl finally reached the public, there was an outpouring of concern and support that transcended racial and economic boundaries. Volunteers joined search efforts, donations poured in to support the investigation, and Relisha's picture appeared on billboards and social media platforms across the region. But the delayed response to her disappearance also highlighted uncomfortable truths about whose stories receive attention and whose do not. Critics pointed out that if Relisha had been a white child from a middle-class family, her absence would not have gone unnoticed for 30 days. The fact that she was a black girl living in a homeless shelter seemed to make her invisible to systems that should have been designed to protect the most vulnerable members of society. The failure of multiple institutions to notice Relisha's absence became a case study in how bureaucratic gaps can swallow the most vulnerable individuals. The school system, the shelter administration, and social services all had pieces of responsibility for tracking her whereabouts, but none had systems robust enough to notice when she simply disappeared. Each organization pointed to procedures that should have worked, but none could explain why those procedures had failed so completely. Shamika Young, Relisha's mother, found herself at the center of public scrutiny and private grief that would define the rest of her life. Questions about her judgment in allowing Tatum to take her daughter overnight, her role in the false medical documentation, and her overall parenting became subjects of public debate. The woman who had lost her child also had to endure judgment from strangers who claimed to know what she should have done differently. The complexity of Shamika's situation reflected the impossible choices faced by parents living in poverty and homelessness. In an environment where resources are scarce and options are limited, the appearance of someone offering help can seem like a blessing rather than a threat. Tatum's gifts and attention might have felt like kindness in a world that had shown little of it, making his true intentions difficult to recognize until it was too late. The legal questions surrounding the case remained complex and unresolved more than a decade later. While Kahlil Tatum was clearly the primary suspect in both his wife's murder and Relisha's disappearance, his suicide prevented any formal prosecution or legal resolution. The case remains officially open, but the practical reality is that justice in any traditional sense may never be achieved. The absence of a body means that even confirming Relisha's death remains impossible, let alone determining the exact circumstances of what happened to her. The theories about Relisha's fate range from the most likely to the desperately hopeful, but all remain theories in the absence of physical evidence. The most probable scenario, based on the timeline and Tatum's behavior, is that he killed Relisha sometime after March 1st and disposed of her body using the items he purchased on March 2nd. The murder of his wife the following weeks might have been motivated by her discovery of his crimes or her threat to expose them. But without concrete proof, other possibilities remain alive in the minds of those who loved Relisha. Some family members cling to the hope that she might still be alive, possibly sold into human trafficking or hidden away somewhere beyond the reach of the investigation. These theories, while unlikely based on the available evidence, provide emotional comfort for people who cannot bear to accept the most probable truth about her fate. The impact of Relisha's disappearance extended far beyond her immediate family, triggering reforms in how Washington handles homeless families and vulnerable children. The District of Columbia General Shelter was eventually closed, replaced by smaller, more manageable facilities designed to provide better oversight and security. New protocols were implemented to ensure that children's absences from school are reported more quickly and that background checks for employees working with vulnerable populations are more thorough. But these systemic changes, while important, could not bring Relisha back or undo the failures that had made her disappearance possible. They represented society's attempt to learn from tragedy, to build better protections for the next child who might find herself in similar circumstances. The reforms became Relisha's legacy, ensuring that her story would continue to protect other children, even though she herself could not be saved. The search for Relisha has never officially ended, and her case remains active with both the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Metropolitan Police Department. Age progression images showing what she might look like today are periodically released, keeping her face in the public consciousness and maintaining hope that someone, somewhere, might recognize the young woman she would have become. These images show a teenager with the same bright eyes and gentle expression, a reminder of all the birthdays and milestones that have passed unmarked. On October 29th each year, Relisha's birthday becomes a day of remembrance rather than celebration, a time when those who knew her gather to light candles and share memories of the vibrant child who was taken too soon. She would have turned 19 in 2024, a young woman potentially starting college, beginning a career, or starting a family of her own. Instead, her age remains frozen at 8 years old, preserved in surveillance footage and school photographs that capture a moment in time that can never be recovered. The homeless shelter where Relisha lived has been demolished, replaced by development that erased the physical reminders of where her story began. But the memories of those who knew her there remain vivid, particularly among the children who played with her in the communal spaces and understood the unique challenges of growing up without a permanent home. Their memories preserve the image of a girl who found joy despite difficult circumstances, who made friends easily and brought light to a place that could often feel dark. The staff members who worked at the shelter during Relisha's time there carry their own burden of memory, wondering if they could have recognized the signs of danger earlier or intervened more effectively. Some have left social services work entirely, unable to continue in a field where the stakes proved to be literally matters of life and death. Others have remained, motivated by Relisha's story to be more vigilant and more proactive in protecting the children in their care. The hotel corridors where Relisha was last seen have been renovated and remodeled, but the surveillance footage that captured her final known moments remains in evidence files that may never be closed. The grainy images have been analyzed frame by frame by investigators and family members, searching for any clue that might have been missed, any detail that might point toward understanding what happened next. But the footage ends where Relisha's trail goes cold, leaving only questions where answers should be. The Days Inn on New York Avenue continues to operate, serving travelers and temporary residents who have no connection to the tragedy that unfolded in its rooms. But for those involved in the investigation, the hotel represents a crucial piece of the puzzle, the last place where Relisha was confirmed to be alive. The room where she was last seen has been occupied by countless other guests since that March day in 2014. Each unaware of the history that lingers in a space that looks no different from any other budget hotel room. The case of Relisha Rudd stands as one of Washington's most heartbreaking unsolved mysteries, a reminder of how quickly a child can disappear and how difficult it can be to find answers when the systems designed to protect them fail. Her story continues to resonate because it represents not just one family's tragedy, but a broader indictment of how American society treats its most vulnerable members. The fact that an 8-year-old girl could vanish for weeks without anyone noticing reveals gaps in our social safety net that persist despite reforms and good intentions. Today, more than 10 years later, investigators still receive tips and leads about possible sightings of Relisha, though none have led to concrete developments in the case. Each call represents someone who has been touched by her story, someone who sees her face in a crowd or remembers details that might be important. The persistence of public interest in her case demonstrates the lasting impact of a story that refuses to be forgotten, a mystery that continues to demand justice even when justice seems impossible to achieve. The playground at Payne Elementary School, where Relisha should have been playing with her classmates, still echoes with children's voices, but those who knew her remember a particular laugh, a specific way she had of approaching new friends, a brightness that stood out even in the challenging circumstances of her life. Teachers who had her in their classes speak of a child who was eager to learn despite the instability in her life, who completed assignments even when she didn't have a quiet place to work, who maintained hope for the future even when the present was difficult. The community organizations that work with homeless families in Washington still speak Relisha's name, using her story to advocate for better protections and more comprehensive services. Her disappearance became a rallying cry for reform, evidence of what can happen when vulnerable children fall through bureaucratic cracks. The Playtime Project, which had provided services to Relisha during her time at the shelter, continues its work with renewed dedication, knowing that play and normal childhood experiences can be crucial for children facing extraordinary challenges. As each year passes without resolution, the case of Relisha Rudd becomes less about finding a missing child and more about honoring a life that was cut short and learning from failures that should never be repeated. Her story serves as a permanent reminder that in a society as wealthy and technologically advanced as America, no child should be able to disappear without immediate notice, and no family should have to face the uncertainty of not knowing what happened to their loved one. The investigation remains active, the search for answers continues, and the hope for resolution, however unlikely, persists in the hearts of those who refuse to let Relisha's story end in silence. Somewhere in the sprawling landscape of the American mid-Atlantic region, there may still be evidence waiting to be discovered, witnesses who haven't come forward, or information that could finally provide the closure that her family and community desperately need. Until that day comes, if it ever does, Relisha Rudd remains Washington's lost daughter, a bright-eyed 8-year-old whose purple jacket and pink boots became symbols of innocence betrayed and systems that failed when they were needed most. Her memory lives on in the reforms that bear her legacy, in the increased vigilance of those who work with vulnerable children, and in the hearts of those who refuse to forget that behind every missing person statistic is a human being whose life mattered, whose loss created ripples that continue to spread through the community she left behind. The surveillance footage from that March morning shows the last few seconds of Relisha Rudd's known existence, but it cannot show the impact she continues to have on the world she left too soon. In a city full of monuments to the famous and powerful, perhaps the most important memorial to Relisha Rudd is not made of stone or bronze, but of changed policies, increased awareness, and the determination of those who work every day to ensure that no other child disappears into the silence that swallowed her whole.